guy joining us on the line right now. I like to call him the voice of reason on Fox News. I'm a big fan of his. I think he does a great job on Fox News. That would be Juan Williams joining us right now on the line. Juan, I appreciate you taking some time to join us. How are you?
I'm good. What a pleasure. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a
So,
lot.
Juan, I have to start on a lighter note. How are you able to sit next to Jesse Waters every day? I give you so much credit for that.
He's a friend, but he's a wild one, isn't he? Yesterday we were talking about fireworks. You know, a lot of places are having just a lot of fireworks going on all night. The kids are playing with them, and people are getting irritated, especially in the big cities. And so he said, yeah, he's the guy in high school who would have had the stuff. That's the way he described himself. If you wanted fireworks, illegal fireworks, you'd have had to find Jesse.
It's funny. I actually grew up a couple miles down the road from where Jesse grew up. So I heard Jesse was a popular guy in high school. But anyway, let's move on to some. Obviously, there's a lot of serious topics to talk about, Juan, and you're an extremely intelligent guy. So let's start with this: the Bubba Wallace situation. Wanted to get your thoughts on it. My opinions, and we're going to go over this later on in the show as well, is that Bubba did absolutely nothing wrong. Maybe NASCAR jumped the gun a little bit, but I think it's better to be safe than sorry. What do you make of this whole situation? And now people, character assassination, even some on your network, and certainly I don't blame you for that, but there are people that are attacking this man, Bubba Wallace, who I think did absolutely nothing wrong. What do you say?
Of course he did nothing wrong. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, I guess the allegation would be that he put the noose there and it was a hoax, along the lines of the guy in Chicago who apparently, hired somebody and put on a MAGA hat and all that kind of stuff. But I don't see that at all. I don't see the parallel here. I think people are reaching to avoid what is an ugly truth, which is that NASCAR for years featured that Confederate flag, and that even after NASCAR banned the flag, there were people who were flying the flag over Talladega and people who were having a parade featuring the flag outside. That there is an element there that does not want to deal with racism in the society and doesn't appreciate the idea that NASCAR and Bubba Wallace would take a lead in saying it's time for the flag to go.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I got to say, how do you deal with the fact that yes, there are people on your network, for example, Laura Ingraham yesterday, who did basically a 5-minute character assassination of Bubba Wallace. It's okay to disagree, right? We all disagree every day on different ideas, but I mean, how do you deal with the fact that there are people over there that are attacking Bubba Wallace, like Laura Ingraham, when I just don't understand why?
Well, I respond to it. I mean, she has her audience, I suspect, and to me, it's one of these things that can be aggravating, but I do believe in free speech, and if that's what she believes, she should say it. But, I think people also have the opportunity to respond, and I respond, as you know, someone who watches, I respond. I speak my mind, and to my mind, Bubba Wallace is a hero, and I'm sorry to see that other people would want to demean him or diminish him, because he's in a tough spot as the only black driver at the top of the circuit. And you know what? I think that when you look at the way that the other drivers responded,
yeah, it was great.
Lining up behind him,
yeah,
I was amazed. And it tells you something about what's going on in America. This is not the old conversation about race. Something's different, and I think it threatens a lot of people. That's why the guy was flying the Confederate flag over the raceway.
Agree. And by the way, you're talking about all the drivers that were behind Bubba Wallace on Monday. They were all giving him hugs. It was emotional. And you know what? Regardless of whether this was a hate crime or not a hate crime, it was a great moment for NASCAR to see everybody. I couldn't agree with you more. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Juan Williams, Fox News analyst, does a great job over there. So I want to ask you about this Rayshard Brooks funeral, and then I'll ask you about the case. My personal opinions are I don't think the officer did anything wrong. I think when you point a taser at someone and shoot it, I don't blame the officer for shooting his weapon, but we'll get to that. I want to talk a little bit about Bernice King, of course, the youngest child of Martin Luther King. She said yesterday she compared the Brooks killing to the murder of civil rights icon Medgar Evers and Nelson Mandela. I mean, what do you make of that? I thought that was inappropriate. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's hyperbole. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about somebody like Medgar Evers, who was such an important activist, leader of the NAACP in Mississippi, and who was assassinated in his driveway, assassinated. There's no getting away from that. He was not involved in any kind of activity. He wasn't involved with the police. This was an assassin who came and sought him out and killed him. I don't see the parallel, so I just disagree with her in that. But I understand the hyperbole. I think what she's trying to do is to make Mr. Brooks into a hero, and to say this is something that is, worthy of the society recognizing an injustice and coming to a moment of change, which I think we're coming to as an American society. Black, white, Asian, Latino, everybody seems to be in touch with the change in the atmosphere and the change in opinion, and that's been really precipitous over the last month.
I agree with that. I guess that some of the cases I disagree with. I don't like it when people bring up Michael Brown because I think that was a justified shooting. Certainly the Philando Castillos, and there's many others, sadly, that we can name that were not justified, in my personal opinion. But let's talk about Rayshard Brooks for a minute. What is an officer, Juan, supposed to do when they get into a scuffle and there's punches thrown, and then as the suspect is running, he turns around with one of the officer's tasers, points it, and shoots it at an officer? I mean, I guess you can Monday morning quarterback and say, well, geez, it would have been better if the officer just let him go. How can you charge that officer with murder? To me, it makes absolutely no sense. What do you say?
Well, I frame it differently than you do. First of all, remember, they were talking for like 40 minutes. They had a conversation, right. Two officers and Mr. Brooks. And he clearly was intoxicated, had fallen asleep in the food line in his car at the Wendy's, had pulled the car to the side on the orders of the police. They were engaged. Then they decided to arrest, and it's when the arrest is taking place that he begins then to resist arrest. And that's when the scuffling ensues. That's when things get out of control. That's when he steals one of their tasers. That's when he fires the taser. And then comes this moment, and I think this is where we disagree, where Brooks is shot in the back. So, to my mind, and I'm thinking along the lines of the need for police reform in this country. First of all, why wouldn't you just let this guy go? I mean, if he's going to resist arrest, he's not in the car, so he's no longer drunk driving. He says he wants to go to his sister's house.
Can I respond to that?
It's just, to me, the mentality is, I would avoid this situation. I wouldn't be in this situation.
Understood.
So to me, I think it was, at that juncture, bad, terrible judgment, and shooting a man in the back, that's hard to justify. He had already shot the taser and missed, so I don't know. I don't feel good about it at all.
You touched on a bunch of things there, and I get your side, and you're not the first person to have that opinion. I guess when I hear shot somebody in the back, what a lot of people leave out, and you didn't leave it out, but a lot of people leave out, he turned around, he pointed a taser at an officer and shot it at an officer. I think that's very important. Number two, listen, they could have talked for 2 hours before that incident, but the bottom line is the man resisted arrest, he threw punches at officers, and he grabbed the taser. I think that's also extremely important to note. And the third thing I would say, let him go. If I'm living in a neighborhood, Juan, or you're living in that neighborhood with your family, are you comfortable with a man who just escaped police, attacked police? He's drunk, as you said, and he's running around town with a taser. And I don't think I would feel comfortable with that. I mean, I guess that's do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, first of all, I think that, we can go back. I'm not sure about this, but I think that after he fired the taser, his emphasis was on running, not, holding or repeatedly firing it. But the second thing to say is, I don't think he was a threat to public safety. He wanted to get to his sister's house, and I later read that there was something against him, maybe a warrant for missed child support payments or something like that. I'm not sure, but I think that there was some fear on his part that an arrest would lead to him going back to jail or something like that.
Yes, correct.
Again, the reason that I mentioned that they talked for so long before the scuffle is that he wasn't belligerent. He wasn't rude to the police. He, in fact, people have noted, was calling them sir and trying to figure out how to deal with this. But I think he had a hidden fear of going back to jail, and that's why he reacted to the arrest in the way that he did. Whatever the case, I just think the shooting, and sad to say, killing, was a tremendous, tremendous overreaction. I don't know about that one. That's why I have trouble saying it's justified, even though, as you point out, he did fire a taser not a deadly weapon, but an incapacitating weapon at an
Fair
officer.
enough. I guess I'm not speaking in legalities, and you're a real smart guy. I guess my personal feeling, I feel bad for Brooks' family and friends. I don't feel bad for Rayshard Brooks. And the reason why I don't is because, in my personal opinion, and we might disagree on this, if you're dumb enough in society to resist arrest, throw punches at police officers, steal one of their tasers, turn around and shoot it at an officer, I'm not sure I'm going to feel sorry for somebody like you. Now, George Floyd, completely different situation. And let me be clear on this. Ahmaud Arbery, that was a lynching. But I don't feel bad for a man who assaults police officers and then is dumb enough to shoot a taser at a cop. I mean, am I wrong in saying that? I mean, that's my opinion. I don't feel bad for this guy.
He's dead. I think we can feel bad for him and for his family. So, yeah, I mean, to your point, he did a lot of stupid things. He did things that you and I would never do because we don't feel that way. First of all, neither of us has anything outstanding. And we think, oh, my gosh, this is not going to just be a night in the hoosgow. We're going to get out and let's try to clear this up or leave it to the lawyers or whoever. This guy, he felt like his future was at risk. And I don't know, again, incapacitated. I think he was so intoxicated he had fallen asleep. So it's not as if we're dealing with, Mike Tyson here. We're dealing with a guy who is drunk, asleep, and now has been wakened and has been talking to the police for 40 minutes.
Understood. I mean, let me ask you this last question, and then we'll move on. What do you think should happen to this officer? If you, Juan Williams, are the judge right now, judge and jury right now, Juan Williams, would you give this guy time in jail, and how long do you think he deserves for the crime that you think he committed?
I don't even know what the rules are, so you might help me. Maybe you know. What is he charged? He's charged with second-degree murder, I think?
Yeah, second-degree murder, a bunch of battery.
What is the sentence for that? I don't know.
My understanding is he could spend the rest of his life behind bars, and he could get the death penalty, but they took the death penalty off the table, my understanding. So he could spend the rest of his life in jail. Again, we disagree on what took place maybe, but I want to know from your perspective.
So from my perspective, he should have full access to the law, the land. But to my mind, when you go through this process and it begins with the charges, I tend more towards manslaughter or something along that lines, and I don't know what the sentence would be for that. So I'll leave that to you. But
here's why even though we disagree a little bit with what happened, here's why I agree with what you just said. When you go back, Juan, to the George Zimmerman case, they went for murder, right? And I felt like if they went for manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter, George Zimmerman probably would have been convicted. I think it's an injustice to overcharge somebody, and then it's going to be more difficult for them to put somebody behind bars. Would you agree with that?
It can be, but in this case, it might lead to a plea deal.
Right. That's possible. You're right. It could be a plea deal. Again, he's Juan Williams, Fox News analyst. A couple more quick questions for you, Juan. Let's talk a little bit about these Black Lives Matter protests. I believe that the majority of the people in BLM just want equality. I believe they want to be treated better as a whole by law enforcement. I totally understand that. I believe I believe a lot of people on Fox News want to portray these BLM protesters as anti-police, as horrible human beings. They're all causing riots. They're all causing havoc. I just simply disagree with that. I think the majority of these people are good people. What do you say?
I couldn't agree more. I got to tell you, so I live in Washington, D.C., so the protests here are almost now like an annual trek for church groups, for children's groups. People want to take pictures, and there's an area near the White House where the mayor painted Black Lives Matter on the street. It is so peaceful in general. Now, they have had some outbursts at night, and I think you're seeing people gather there who are agitators, and I fear there are a lot of homeless people and a lot of people looking for some trouble, whatever. But when we talk about the protest and the idea that people were upset by the George Floyd case, upset by what happened, I guess doubly so with Ahmaud Arbery and some of these others, people are simply rising up and saying to the government and to the authorities, we've got to have a change here. This is not good. This is not the way American society should work. We should all be treated as equals. I've heard people say, oh, well, all lives matter. I say that's a rebuke at this point to a very simple statement, that black lives matter. Black lives have to matter so all lives can matter. And I think we all have to understand that the way the society has been structured, the way that the police have operated oftentimes is far more aggressive, if not brutal, in dealing with black people, especially black men, and I would add especially poor, low-income black men from segregated neighborhoods.
What would you say to somebody on Fox News, and you probably have spoken to these people, some of them who say, oh, somebody who is white, that doesn't know what it's like to be pulled over for no reason, that doesn't know what it's like to be, followed in a store because of their skin color, because they think they might, steal something. What would you say to somebody that comes from the perspective of, well, all lives matter, white lives matter too, and just have no understanding of why this movement is going on in the first place? What do you say to people like that?
Wow. Well, of course all lives matter, but I just explained too often in American society, given what we've seen, and you listed a number of names. I mean, we could throw in Breonna Taylor down in Louisville,
right?
Of recent vintage, that too often the way the power structure works, the way the police work, and the way the police unions protect cops, even when they're wrong, is to suggest that black lives don't matter. Black people don't have access to the political power, to the economic power, to the kind of protection that comes from the unions for the police officers. They have none of that. And when something is done to them, it looks like their lives don't matter. And so that's why we have this phrase, Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Maybe I would say to that person, let's look at the lone Republican who's black in the U.S. Senate, Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, who is taking the lead in terms of trying to get some legislation, police reform legislation, done in Congress. He said 7 times, including while he's been a United States Senator and on Capitol Hill, he has been stopped and questioned unfairly. People don't think that he's even a U.S. Senator.
Yep, there you go. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm glad he brought that up, by the way, because I think that's what many African Americans, the point they're trying to make here. It's not necessarily about police officers killing African Americans, but it's just as important, if not more, to understand that it's about the way as a whole law enforcement treat minorities. I want to move on and ask you a little bit about these Confederate statues that are being taken down. It's happened right here in Las Vegas. It's happening really all over the country. And my opinion is this. As someone who is Jewish, I wouldn't want a Hitler statue in the United States of America, right? I wouldn't want any building called the Adolf Hitler Center. Many of these people, not all of them, but many of them owned slaves. They owned African Americans. I'm perfectly okay with taking these statues down on a case-by-case basis and the names of some of these buildings. What do you say?
Yes, and I think that, a moment ago you asked me how I would explain, Black Lives Matter to someone who just said, all lives matter and was trying to somehow move on or marginalize the movement or even demonize it. Well, in this case, I think that what you've got is a situation where people have to understand it's not a matter of where we stop. And I hear lots of critics say, oh, so they want to tear down a statue of, in London, Winston Churchill. Or how about move Teddy Roosevelt from the front of a museum in New York? And I would say, wait a second. I have to say it's not a matter of where we draw the line, but let's think about where we start. Because it makes no sense to me that we would name our military bases after Confederate generals who were traitors to the United States and also people who were trying to protect the institution of slavery, that we have literally had to change the Constitution to outlaw the 13th Amendment.
Right.
One other thing. We celebrate winners in American society. We raise statues to winners. These folks are losers. And one other point, wait a second, why is it that these statues were put up during the Reconstruction period when whites in the South were threatened by the idea of black freedom and wanted to absolutely assert white supremacy? And why is it that the biggest error, I should say, in which these statues and monuments were constructed, late 1950s, after the Brown decision, again, as whites in the South were threatened by the idea of black children going to school with whites, and they wanted to assert white supremacy. This is the truth of this. This has nothing to do with heritage, nothing to do with our history. We all know our history, much as the Germans know their history.
Correct.
But as you point out, they don't have any statues to Hitler.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. I know you're really active on social media talking about Joe Biden and the upcoming elections in November, and I guess this will be my last question for you. I guess it's a two-part question. Number one, what would you say to the Republicans out there that say Joe Biden's been in his basement, he's not out there doing anything, he's not making public appearances? And then my second part to this question is, quite simply, who do you think is going to win in November and why?
Well, I think the best thing to say to somebody who doesn't like Joe Biden's political strategy at this moment is, boy, those polls, and it's not one poll, it's not two polls, it's all the polls, look pretty good. His fundraising is just excellent at the moment. Last month, he outraised President Trump. So, it's one of those things like, if you're in the corner of a big fight and the fighter is doing pretty well in all the scorecards, you might think, well, gee, why am I going to change the strategy if he's doing well so far?
Yeah, good point.
The only counter would be, remember the polls from 2016? People like you, Juan Williams, you were off. Donald Trump won, and you'd be right. I was off. But I think that the distance here in terms of the margin is a whole different ball of wax. And secondly, I don't know what it is that Donald Trump has to say about Joe Biden that comes anything close to all the calumny and charges he had against Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden's not a guy that's easily hated or in that way.
I agree.
And then what was your second question?
Who do you think is going to win? We only got about a minute here. Who do you think is going to win?
I'm not sure because I think that clearly Donald Trump has the advantage of incumbency. He's got the pulpit, and gosh, even though he had those small audiences, he gets big audiences in terms of TV ratings, as his campaign points out. And he's going to keep stirring the pot. So, you know what? I would guard against complacency at this juncture. I don't know that it's in the bag for anybody.
I think it's close.
Think this is going to be a close race.
I agree. Well, let me say this in closing, Juan. Thank you so much for your time. And can you tell Jesse Waters for me to take it easy on the hair gel, please?
Hey, you guys should go out and take a look at my book. I wrote a book called What the Hell Do You Have to Lose? Trump's War on Civil Rights, and I'd love it if you take a look at it.
I will absolutely do that, and after I read that book, we'd love to have you on again, Juan, if that's okay. I think you are fantastic over there at Fox News. Keep up the great work, my friend. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right,
Yeah,
there you
thanks
go.
a lot, Juan.
Juan Williams, Fox News. I love that guy. He's fantastic.